embarrassing. Don't know how much of that you heard. On the hot take. But we're here to talk about the tremendous book, Chokepoint Capitalism, how big tech and big content captured creative labor markets and how we'll win them back, by Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow. It's a great book. You should read it. And Rebecca, we started with you, and let's just go over the question again. This book is focused on the creative labor class, musicians, filmmakers, authors. Monopoly exists in all industries. Does it have a particular power in the creative industries?
Yeah, look, we know that creative labor is more desirable than other forms of labor. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that you get to, very often you get to do creative work with more of your sort of full humanity instead of having to cut off parts of that in order to, turn into Homo economicus, which is required in so many other kinds of jobs. But we also see that creative workers are the canaries in the coal mine. We had this massive natural experiment where suddenly we saw that all kinds of jobs could be performed remotely, which means they can be outsourced to the lowest bidder globally. And, while, there's a lot of fear mongering around robots taking our jobs, it's quite difficult for robots to do things that are very simple for humans to do. They have to be retooled all the time. But we do need to be worried about, whether we are going to have a way of making a living when our corporate masters are driven entirely by considerations disconnected from community and purely linked to profit. And so we see that, focusing on this concept of the choke point, this idea that these corporations create these hourglass-shaped markets that have got sort of consumers at one end and suppliers at the other, and themselves squatting at the neck, where they've distorted this in a way that forces everybody to go through them so that they get to mediate access and they get to extract more than their fair share. That's the thing that we've got to be worried about, whether it's in the creative industries or anywhere squatting else. At the neck, where they've
you guys have a line here that I just loved.
That forces everybody
people's
to go
passions
through them
are
so that they get
weaponized
to
to
mediate
facilitate their
access
exploitation.
and they get to extract more
and
than
it just
their fair
resonated
share.
with me.
That's the thing that we've got to be worried about, whether it's in the creative
relate to
industries
this.
or
Like, I would have
anywhere
gnawed
else.
off my right arm and handed it to the book publisher, in exchange for publishing my first book. Does that partially explain why what you guys described as choke points are so pervasive in the culture industries?
So I think that's part of it. I think that wherever you have what the sociologists call vocational awe, just this sense of mission, there is an opportunity to squeeze the wage bill and not risk the workers quitting their jobs. Nurses will stay on the job even after they are required to go on food stamps, because the alternative is abandoning the patients they care about to, get bed sores and not get fed and so on. So, this is true of teachers. And we all know the joke about the artist joke, rather, about the kid who runs away and joins the circus, and his dad finds him shoveling elephant shit and says, "Son, come home." And he says, "What, and quit show business?" So, the vocational law is definitely a risk factor. But there's a second risk factor that I think is very important with creators, which is that we have this policy that is supposed to help us with this problem that there's way more people who want to make art than there is a market for art, and we have this exploitability and so on, which is copyright, this limited exclusive right over our works. And there are times when copyright can do a lot of work to rebalance the negotiating position between creators and intermediaries and investors, so publishers or distributors or what have you. But as the market becomes more concentrated, then whatever copyrighted is the creator has been given by Congress or Parliament can be taken away from them as a condition of reaching their audience. That once there's a choke point, right? Once you have to deal with one of a handful of companies, then giving the creator extra copyright is like giving bullied kids extra lunch money. It just doesn't matter how much lunch money you give them; they are never going to get lunch, right? And this is true whether or not the bullies then use some of that stolen lunch money to run a campaign saying, "Won't we think of the world's starving school children and give them more lunch money?" Still, it's still not going to help. There's no amount of lunch money that solves it. You need structural interventions. And so, you have this double whammy where the fact that creators are in increasingly dire straits prompts calls from intermediaries and investors, but also from creators who have a very sophisticated understanding of how to make art and a less sophisticated understanding of how artistic markets work to increase the amount of copyright that they get, which just makes things worse. This is like the medieval bloodletter, right? Like if you get better, then the bloodletting worked. If you don't get better, then we need more bloodletting.
Rebecca, tell us the story of this book. Now, I don't know if viewers heard any of the introduction, but you're a professor at the Melbourne Law School and a director of the Intellectual Property Research Institute of Australia. So you're there on the other side of the world. Both of you guys have studied the problems of copyright and DRM and corporate concentration for many years. I've been reading both of you for a long time. How did this book come to being, and why did you guys decide to focus this industry spanning problem of concentration and monopoly and monopsony on this very relatable field of culture?
I'm going to answer that in one sec, but first I'm just going to mention I now cannot see or hear Cory at all. So if I start talking about something that he's already talked about, Brad, I require you to be an interpreter to bridge those words. Okay, but I do love this story about how we came to do this. We knew each other a little bit. We'd known each other a little bit for a long time. And then Cory came over. We were doing some stuff together in Melbourne in sort of early 2018. And in a taxi on the way back to the city after one of these events, we started talking about our shared frustration over the fact we've been in the copyright wars for so long. We're constantly being faced with this like false dichotomy. Like, do you care about creators or do you care about access, right? Do you want artists to starve, or, that's the choice that we were given. And we were so tired of this because obviously that's not really the choice, even though that's the way the rhetoric is painted. And what we were seeing happening is that, regardless of whether it was big tech or big content, the problem was really that we had these corporations that had so much power that they were using to shake down creators and audiences, and that whether you cared about creation or you cared about access, or like everybody does, you cared about both, what we were seeing is that was causing the resources that we did have to make all of these good things happen go into the wrong pockets. And so we then saw that it was a problem about big business, not a problem about there not being enough copyright, that artists weren't working hard enough, or anything like that. Fast forward to 2020, when I was locked in my apartment in Melbourne, and I decided to take that as a rare moment of freedom, that instead of thinking of this as, oh no, I'm trapped, I was thinking of this as, oh, actually I'm freed from, the whole program of work that I've had for this year that was going to be sort of international field work in New York. What do I want to do instead? What's the story I really need to tell? And it was this one, right? I just read an amazing book by Peter Carstensen on monopsony. It crystallized so many things for me. I was so energized and excited about this. So I sat down to start working on it. And I think I worked on it for about 3 weeks, and it was so exhilarating, but frustrating because I was arguing with myself while locked in my apartment. And I started thinking, this book would be so much better if Cory Doctorow wrote it with me. And so I emailed him. I said, hey, Cory, how about we write this book together? That's a thing you can do, by the way. You can just ask Cory to write a book with you, and he will. Yeah, I can't hear him, so I don't know if he's done the usual thing where every time I say that he jumps in, he's just like, absolutely do not do that, please don't do that. But we did write it together, and that was my, the Melbourne lockdown. Obviously this extended a lot longer than we were expecting. The Melbourne lockdowns were almost sort of 2 years of us being locked in our homes, and my lifeline to the outside world was Cory, and I could have done worse for sure.
I love that. That's brilliant. Well, let's. I want to kind of stress test your thesis. Sadly, I'm old enough to remember a time when we had 4 channels on the TV, in music, 5 record labels, a few independents, Tower Records. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. We had, I think it was Revolution Records. In books, 6 publishing houses and a giant called Barnes and Noble that everybody was scared of. And so a different kind of concentration existed, and maybe has always existed, except for, an idealized long ago. And of course, artists famously have always gotten screwed. So, Cory, let me ask you, is it really that different today? Is today's concentration any worse than yesteryear's?
So I think you're starting your story too late. So when I started writing, there were 30 publishers in New York. And when I was a kid reading, there were 300 mass market distributors nationwide distributing to lots of independently owned grocery stores and pharmacies, which is where people found all their science fiction, fantasy, and so on. The reason it's called mass market is because it was designed not to be sold in bookstores. It was designed to be sold outside of the trade and to these mass market retailers. When Reagan deregulated retail and when we got the rise of the big box stores, the number of distributors nationwide crashed from 300 to 3. Today it's 1. And so there really is a big difference.
Ingram's?
That's Ingram, yeah. And so there really is a big difference. And it's true also at the mid-size level. So at the mid-level, rather. So Publishers Group West was a distributor that distributed dozens of mid-sized houses. Publishers like Roaring Brook and Four Walls, Eight Windows, and so on. All these great kind of mid-sized publishers in New York. They got bought by a giant distributor. That giant distributor's C-suite was led out of the building in handcuffs by the FBI. They went out of business. The parent company went out of business. All of those companies went out of business. Today, almost all of them are part of Hachette, which is one of the big five publishers, right? So you can see how consolidation produced these brittle points. I also can remember, a wonderful time when the internet wasn't just 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And when you look at the growth of the giants, it wasn't driven by making the best product. Google is not a company that invented a bunch of products that we like better than other products, and so we always did. Almost everything Google's invented failed, right? Google Video was not a successful product. Almost every successful product Google has ever marketed is a product they bought from someone else on terms that historically would have been prohibited until we started deregulating the mergers and acquisitions market and produce this incredibly concentrated industry. So you're right that artists have had a bad shake at different times. One of the things that the intimate interconnection between art and technology has meant is that even though there have been great consolidations at various times in art, those consolidations were periodically overturned. That radio changed the market, cable changed the market, CDs changed the market, MP3s changed the market. It's not true anymore. One of the stories that we tell in the book is how the big 3 labels, by dint of owning 70% of all the recordings, required Spotify to sell or to give major chunks of equity to them as a condition of allowing it to have any of their catalog. And then they decided how Spotify would work. And so maybe the new boss will eventually become like the old boss, but when the new boss starts out, he wants to lure in some of that talent that might make his product viable. If you never get a new boss, you don't even get those reprieves.
And Rebecca, I'm gathering from your expression that maybe you still can't hear Cory.
Nothing at all. I can't see.
It was brilliant, and and we're talking obviously about the differences in previous periods of consolidation and corporate concentration and today, and one difference, and I'm kind of challenging you guys here on the thesis and whether the deal for producers is really all that worse than it has in ages past. And one explicit difference, it seems to me, is that there are fewer gatekeepers at least to beginning to reach a large audience, right? You can upload your content to TikTok or YouTube. You can self-publish on Amazon, with very little upfront costs. Musicians can publish to Bandcamp. I mean, in that respect, can we admit that today's giants are maybe better than the ones they've displaced?
Yeah, what's super interesting is that the creative industries have always been choke pointed from as early as we had them, right? So, we had the advent of the printing press, and then we had the stationers company get this monopoly that controls the printing of books. And then even when the first copyright law was created, which was supposed to help writers to secure property rights to them for the first time, that those big stationers, they controlled the printers, and they refused to print the books, and there's no way to go except through them. So they were still able to distort those markets in the same way. So we have always had these choke points. And if we look at the music industry, for example, the recorded music industry, the major record labels were the ones that controlled distribution into stores. It was much more difficult for independent music to reach audiences. So again, that was a huge choke point. And we saw that the abuses from the major labels were, really quite extraordinary. We go through that quite a bit in the book, quite extraordinary, up until Napster and the popularization of the internet and digital technologies and peer-to-peer file sharing. While that decimated the business model, and it was blood on the walls. We don't want to understate that. There were so many people that lost their livelihoods overnight. But the flip side to that is it did democratize music making and distribution. Those choke points were smashed in some ways, because if you were starting out and you were looking to find a label, there were or a different way of getting your music to audiences, there were other ways of doing that did not involve going through the major labels. And that is what forced them to actually reform the most egregious parts of their, the most egregious abuses that they had been doing, for some time. So in that context, they're way less bad than they had been previously. But what we argue is happening is that we're seeing those markets close back up. That promise of the internet and digital technologies to allow people to do things differently and to reach audiences so much more cheaply, that is being steadily eroded by the increase of choke points that we're seeing in all of these different markets. And I think one of the reasons that we're seeing this so much is that people are very conscious that this is how you make money, right? The orthodoxy now being taught in business schools is that competition is for losers. Thanks, Peter Thiel, for that one.
Right.
That what you want to do is you want to create a business that gives you a moat against competition that stops other people from entering the market, and that rather than making something or providing a service that people need or that makes the world better, what you should be aiming to do is to position yourself around or sort of between the people who are making those things and the people who need them, in order to extract value from other people's work without actually really necessarily providing meaningful value yourself. And so that's, I think, what a danger that we really have to be looking out for.
And that's the danger for artists. But now, Cory, let me ask you about the situation with consumers or customers. I mean, I think one of the things that's bedeviled the movement that sort of derided as hipster antitrust, and you guys acknowledge this in the book, which is that it's kind of like concentrated industries can be a wonderful experience for consumers. Like every video, every book, all of recorded music, with obviously big explicit exceptions. But for people who don't think hard about it, it's a great time to be a consumer of the arts. So given that, how do you what's missing? I mean, is it like the specter that maybe one day things will get worse for consumers if we allow these concentrated industries to keep getting more consolidated?
Well, I mean, first, let's start by saying that nobody ever bought a record or a book because they really liked the person who calculated the royalty statements or wrote the contract for those books, right? People buy those because they care about the people who make those works, right? And so I think that there's a natural sense in which people who pay for media would hope that the creative workers who produce that work are benefiting from it. I mean, if you remember the rhetoric from the Napster Wars, was if you keep downloading, then artists will starve. I think a lot of people who buy Spotify subscriptions feel like they're doing the right thing. I also think that a lot of people who buy Spotify subscriptions thought, historically, this has changed a little, but thought that when they listened to an artist, that some money went to that artist. And that wasn't how it worked. It's changed a little. They had a secret accounting practice where the Spotify would calculate, say, all the streams from a Sony artist that month. They would send royalty payment to Sony along with the analytics about who'd listen to what. And then Sony would decide how to split that money up. And if you spent every hour that you listened to Spotify listening to some band you loved in high school, And that band, even though they accounted for 100% of your listening, still accounted for like 0.0000001% of all listening, then they probably got none of the money you gave to Spotify that month. And so I think a lot of us understand that this is not a great system. So even, if we put on our consumer hats, when we consume, we want to consume with some degree of ethicalness, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have to use Spotify. We just go back to torrenting all of our music. That said, I don't think it's a specter that things will get worse. I think it's just a fact that things get worse. I really like the first sort of 6 or 7 Beatles albums. Only 2 of them are available on Spotify or Amazon or YouTube Music. The rest are available as playlists that then mix in other artists who paid for payola or who Spotify hopes that I'll start listening to. So, I think that the life cycle of a platform business, that is a business that has these surpluses that can be allocated either to users of the platform, business customers of the platform, or the platform's own shareholders, is that it does it in that order. That when these services launch, they allocate a lot of surplus to their users because they want to bring users in. So when Amazon starts, they're subsidizing the cost of shipping, they're losing money on every book and using shareholder capital to make good on it. They're offering the best possible deals. When you search, they match your search as faithfully as they can. And then along come and then you get very dependent on Amazon.
Yeah, and maybe they claw back some value.
Yeah, and then they give it to business customers. So then they're like, hey, we've got Amazon Marketplace. We can get you all kinds of customers you couldn't get elsewhere. Those business customers become also dependent on Amazon. And so once we're locked in, and once we've locked in the business customers, then they start to take that surplus and they give it to their shareholders, which is why when you search Amazon now, something like 80% of the first 6 screens is ads, right? And many of them extremely deceptive, or ads for Amazon products that are knockoffs of the products that Amazon sells. Amazon has a $31 billion advertising market. It's not ads, it's payola to go to the top of search results. It's to put something at the top of the page when you search for something that isn't what you searched for, right? So that is a way in which the services become worse. I call it inshitification, right? The service is becoming inshitified. Spotify has become inshitified. The Kindle Marketplace has become inshitified. All of these services become inshitified.
Well, a great illustration is Ticketmaster, maybe, and something that actually people can understand. And Rebecca, can you now hear Cory? You can't.
No.
Okay, well, we're talking about inshitification and the gradual deterioration of consumer services. And to talk a little bit about Ticketmaster as maybe a great illustration of the threats to consumers of chokepoint capitalism.
Yeah, has Cory talked about Ticketmaster at all yet? Or?
Not yet.
This is like both simultaneously more and less interesting than our usual discussions. I'm just kind of guessing what he's saying.
I feel like we could have fun with this somehow, but we'll try to play
Totally. So Ticketmaster is an amazing example with Live Nation. We crossed like a whole gamut of creative industries in the book. Like we covered so much ground. We spoke to people from all over, and we always gave people the opportunity to remain anonymous if they wanted to during the interviews. And I think nobody took us up on that except almost everybody we spoke to about Live Nation. They were terrified. Right. And even like there was so let me just explain a little bit about the company. People are not really familiar with them. So they're a company that control most of the sort of major concert venues in the world. They also have sort of management and promotion business for artists. And they bought up Ticketmaster, which gave them, an enormous ticketing business as well. Now, if you think about this, the possible dangers of this, which were, shouted out loud and clear by people in the live music industry before the merger went ahead. Hang on a minute. If they're supplying the ticketing to other venues, that gives them this voyeur's view into other people's businesses. They can see, what events are selling, at what rates, is a venue likely to be in trouble because they and may be vulnerable to being bought up very cheaply because they're not selling very well? What are the artists that are like really looking like they might be about to break out, you know, because maybe you want to jump in with your management business and take over their promotion without having to do any of that earlier investment in, you know, incubating this young talent, and, you know, all kinds of other advantages. But the merger was allowed, and they were just required to sort of pinky swear that they wouldn't do anything bad with this information. And then, of course, they did all the bad things exactly as you would expect. But then they added in these kind of, you know, there's lots of this on record because the DOJ did finally investigate. They got these venues who, again, were allowed to sort of testify anonymously, which is very unusual because they were so terrified of retribution. And they described, like, consistently described these kind of mob tactics, you know. They'd be told that, you know, if they didn't stay in the Ticketmaster family, they wouldn't be able to like book any of the big acts that Live Nation controlled, or, you know, wild things like that. And then they would be told, you know, we're not threatening you, we're just laying out your options. You know, it was wild. And so we see that, you know, we've got this sort of ecosystem in music where you don't make money from recorded music, right? So the physical sales are not a thing. Streaming doesn't pay. Artists are told, oh, well, you make money from touring, right? Now, leave aside, you know, Cory and I just did 10 weeks on the road touring Chokepoint last year. And that's way less grueling than being a musician and doing, you know, 1 or 2 shows a day. But like, I was still exhausted by the end of that. Like, leave aside the way that talks about like physically extremely arduous, not available to everyone, really interferes with your family relationships and so on. But like, then the touring that you do is increasingly controlled by this ominous corporation that does not have your best interest at heart and is shaking you down and everybody else in the industry down as well. So it's hugely problematic. And I think that's a great example of why we need to be really careful not to allow anybody to get too much power, and where they do obtain excessive power, to wind it back. And when we talk about how to wind it back, those you know, there's traditional antitrust remedies. So there's those conduct remedies, which is like that pinky swearing that I mentioned, and there's structural remedies, which is like where you break companies up.
Yeah, but let's get to remedies in a minute, because you guys spent almost half the book talking about it. And there's some very clever and creative proposals here. But let me just ask Cory really quickly. I mean, why doesn't like the Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction apply here in the age of Chokepoint capitalism? I mean, shouldn't Live Nation, you know, having muffed the Taylor Swift ticketing opportunity, be displaced? I mean, and what do you make of the rise of companies like TikTok and you know, and others that do seem to be posing a threat to Chokepoint capitalists?
Well, you're right that TikTok came out of nowhere. It has pretty deep financial backing, and it managed to grow in a very different market. So it was able to cross-subsidize from its Chinese operations into its rest of world operations. But the fact you said, well, what about TikTok and other companies?
Well,
and my question is, what other companies?
Okay, but you're right. But I'm reminded of the scene in, I think it was Reservoir Dogs, where they're all holding a gun at each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you do have all the Chokepoint capitalists competing. And if Amazon raises prices or screws with the licensing terms on audiobooks, I've got Apple. And
you're right that having 2 companies is better than having one, for sure. Nevertheless, when you have 2 companies, it's a lot easier for them to converge on a set of terms, especially on the labor side, but also on the consumer side. So, you know, if you want to buy an audiobook, so let's talk about Apple and Amazon here. If you want to buy an audiobook, hypothetically, you can buy it from Audible or you can buy it from Apple Music. Practically speaking, if you're on a mobile device, you just have to buy it from Apple Music. The Audible side, because which is a storefront for Audible. So Apple and Audible have kind of done a joint venture there. To buy direct from Audible, to buy direct from any other retailer on iOS, the retailer has to hand Apple the 30% app tax. The gross margin on an audiobook is 20%. So there's just no other market for it. Now, you're right that under market conditions, you would expect someone to come along and do better, right? And hypothetically, you could reverse engineer iOS. You could make an alternative app store. You could, even do it with deep pockets. You get Walmart to finance it. You could go and do sweetheart deals with like 10% of app manufacturers that represent 90% of Apple's business. You could offer them better commissions than Apple's giving them, and you could lure them all away. The problem is step one: reverse engineer iOS and make your own app store, which is a felony under Section 12.1 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. When you were done paying that, they would hit you with tortious interference with contract, theft of trade secrets. There's probably some non-compete stuff there too, because to make it work, you want to hire someone away. And then there's Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charges, RIP.
You don't want to do
Swartz,
it. You don't want to
right?
do it.
So the state has intervened in a way that has all kinds of rationales, that it's supposed to be helping consumers. It's supposed to be helping artists, ironically. That's what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is supposed to be doing. It's the copyright and DMCA, and actually acts against their interests. They become a kind of means of invoking what Jay Freeman, who created an alternative app store for iOS called Cydia, he calls it a felony contempt of business model, where a dominant firm, if they have enough money to spend, can craft these exotic legal theories that allow them to invoke the power of the state and just require that new entrants not show up. I mean, if you remember when the iPod launched, there was a competitor to them in the digital music space called Real Networks that was arguably bigger than Apple in the digital music space at that point. And they wanted to make it possible to play Real Networks songs on your iPod. So they reverse engineered the iPod and made a synchronizing tool so that you could synchronize the music that you bought, the DRM locked music that you bought, with your iPod without removing the DRM. And Apple made them stop. They threatened to sue them under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So this is kind of how we get to this dysfunctional market where, even if you're a believer in Schumpeter and you think that creative destruction will save us from the worst excesses of mediocre rich guys, Schumpeter has not reckoned with the possibility that when firms are very large, they can capture their regulators. I think Schumpeter believes in regulatory capture, but like all those Chicago guys, the version of regulatory capture he believes in is that if you have regulations, the regulator will be captured, therefore you shouldn't have regulations at all. As opposed to the only way you can have good regulations is to make sure that the companies aren't more powerful than the governments that create them.
Right. And Rebecca, I gather you probably still can't hear Cory, but are you also skeptical about the market's ability to kind of sort through these choke points for the creative destruction to kind of kick in and resolve the stranglehold over creators and consumers?
Yeah, look, we keep getting told that all the money generated by these monopolies will lead to more innovation. That's not at all borne out by the evidence, and in fact, it's an inverse correlation. If we're going to be fixing this, if we're going to be fixing all of the biggest problems that are confronting us right now, unregulated markets are not the way to do it.
Okay. Well, now let's pick up about when I interrupted you about 5 minutes ago with the solutions, and you guys lay out a number of them in the book. And I kind of gathered reading that you're also skeptical about heavy-handed regulatory regimes and particularly the abilities of governments to keep up with fast-moving industries. I mean, so kind of speaking generally, Rebecca, what kind of role should government play?
Look, I think you have to be very very careful about unintended consequences of regulation. I started saying that the traditional antitrust remedies, which are the structural ones of breaking companies up, or the conduct ones of getting them to promise they won't do bad things, they don't work that well in antitrust, but they work particularly badly when we're dealing with this monopsony power, really strong buyers like Amazon and the power it has over publishers, or the big three record labels and music publishers and the power that they've got over recording artists and composers. But we do know that there are some interventions that really do work for this. So anything that directly regulates buyer power, that encourages countervailing power in workers and suppliers, or that encourages new entrants into the market, those are the kinds of interventions that will actually make a difference to allow us to start widening these choke points out. And so in the book, we do spend a lot of time talking about solutions, as you point out. We were so determined that this was not going to be yet another of those chapter 11 books.
Right.
Like, we've all read them.
On the problem, one on the solution.
Yeah, exactly. Some hand wavy stuff. So we really get into the grit of it, right? But we look at the different kinds of interventions that we can get, like at sort of local government level, as well as broader sort of whole of government initiatives. But we also talk about these are not individual solutions either, right? One of the editors we met with in shopping this book around said, look, I really love it, I would love to publish it, but like, all of your solutions are systemic, right, not individual. And we were like, man, you're so close to getting it. But this is exactly right. We are going to need to work together and to demand changes in all of these.
And on that point, there is a call for collective action. And I wonder, Cory, like, what kind of leverage do culture workers have? And where does it come from? Does it come from the top? Is it Taylor Swift and Neil Young and 100 other famous artists banding together to change the terms at Spotify? Or is it the middle? Or is it, maybe kind of more grassroots artists rising up? Because, the famous artists that we've seen, it's too few and far between and uncoordinated. And if the problems are as serious as you guys, suggest and outline, I wonder why we haven't yet seen the outcry from culture workers.
Culture workers are atomized. We are not employees. We're classed as contractors. We are told that this heroic story about our labor, that we're working for ourselves, and that the art is its own reward, and so on. And so there has been very little of that kind of solidarity. And though when it's come, it's been very welcome. You mentioned Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift single-handedly forced Universal to take the windfall it got from Spotify's IPO and promised to pay it to artists, some fraction of it to artists, and in a way that would actually see money going to the artists' pockets. There was widespread suspicion that Universal was planning to credit it to artists' accounts. These are the debts that artists owe for producing their own records. Where the label tells you what session men to use and what studio to use and what producer to use, lets them charge whatever markup they want, and then makes you liable for it. And so all of your royalties go to defraying those costs, and you can make millions of dollars and still never pay off your debt. So they were going to just credit these fictitious accounts, so that the instead of owing an unpayable amount of money, you would owe an unpayable amount of money minus $10,000, which was still an unpayable amount of money. They're actually going to give artists money, which is great when they sell those shares. The problem is that there aren't enough Taylor Swifts, and we can't rely on them to solve all of our problems. This is a bit like relying on billionaires to decide which charities to support instead of having democratically accountable social safety networks. And there is a model for how we can make that work, and it's in the Writers Guild. And we tell the story of the Writers Guild in the book. The Writers Guild is a kind of anomaly in that it is a relic of the New Deal. It represents about 7,000 screenwriters, TV and screen, and movie rather. And in the earliest days, the Writers Guild had a lot of power because it was part of a system that was worked very well for creative workers until the Reagan era, which was that all the creator unions in Hollywood, including the skilled trades unions, could bargain as a body. So the writers, the directors, the scene painters, the actors, the plumbers, and the electricians would all go to the weakest studio and say, what is the next deal going to be? And they would negotiate for it. And when they got the best deal they could go to the next weakest studio and negotiate the same deal with them. They could pick them off one at a time. Under Reagan, that flipped. So the way that it works today is the studios bargain as a unit, and the unions have to bargain individually. And so the studios come together at the start of each deal. They find the weakest union. They extract a deal from them, and they go to the next weakest union. They say, you're going to give them that deal. So you can see how the power declines. So the writers were being screwed not just by the studios, but by the people who are supposed to protect them from the studios, which is their agents. Mm-hmm. The talent agencies in Hollywood had consolidated down to 4 firms, 2 of them owned by private equity companies that had loaded them up with debt and were trying to squeeze them for extra profits. And they revived an old practice called packaging, which is where instead of charging a 10% commission to the writer for the contract you negotiate for them, you very generously give them 100% of the money you negotiate for them, but you negotiate a side deal for yourself from the studio for packaging the writer, the director, and the star together. And that means that every dollar that the writer gets is a dollar that isn't available for you to get as the agent. And showrunners of shows that were part of the golden age of television found out when they got a look at the books that they were getting 10% of the money and their agent was getting 90%. And not only that, but the big four agencies were going to open studios, and they were going to negotiate with themselves for those studios. So you would hire an agent to negotiate with himself about how much money you would get and how much the agent would get, which would work about as well as you expect. So they created this code of conduct. They said, you have to knock this shit off. And the agency said no. And so all 7,000 agents in Hollywood writers in Hollywood fired their agents.
That's right.
And they grounded a 22-month strike. Now, there were some writers in there who were getting a good deal, right? In the same way that, like, if you go to the county fair, by about 10 o'clock, there's some guy walking around with a giant teddy bear that he won on the midway by throwing 3 balls into a peach basket that's got a little hidden scissor mechanism underneath that can knock the balls out. The reason the carny let that guy win the giant teddy bear is so that he would lug it around all day and convince other people to pony up $3 to put 3 balls in the peach basket. But he's the only one who's going to win the giant teddy bear. Joe Rogan gets $100 million, right? There are people in Hollywood who got really good deals. And here is where it matters when stars who are doing well have solidarity. It's not when they unilaterally go to Universal and say, here's what the deal is going to be. It's when they become part of a collective bargaining unit and they throw in with those other writers. And there was no break from the solidarity over 22 months. Every one of those writers stayed out on strike.
And there's another showdown coming later. Another showdown coming later this year. So, okay, we've talked about collective action. We've talked about government regulation. Cory, let me just stay with you. You've got a call for interoperability in the book, and you call it radical interoperability and mandated and competitive compatibility. Now, I know that you could probably deliver a half-an-hour lecture on this. So resisting that urge, distill for us why interoperability has the potential to weaken some of these moats around monopolists.
Well, look, if you can leave a platform, the platform has to earn your business. If leaving the platform costs you something, right? Like if you're a YouTuber and you leave and you can't continue to communicate with your audience, if you're a member of a social media platform and you can't leave without losing your audience, then that social media platform doesn't have to treat you well. They can treat you really badly. So we can make it possible for us to leave and go somewhere else. In fact, that's kind of latent in technology. Like we only know how to make one kind of computer, the universal Turing complete von Neumann machine, and it runs all the programs we know how to write.
But somehow we live in walled gardens now.
And it's because the companies maintain them. It's not because they're built that way. It's not because the physics makes them that way. It's because they added anti-interoperability. So what we got to do is we got to, on the one hand, make them stand up APIs so that we can connect to them. And on the other hand, we got to take away the legal protections that they've been given to stop people from creating their own reverse engineered solutions. If Apple was legitimate when they reverse engineered Microsoft Office and made iWork, Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, then it would be equally legitimate for me to reverse engineer iOS and make my own app store, right? That it's what matters here is not whether it makes Apple's shareholders sad, it's whether it benefits Apple's users, their customers.
Okay, but Rebecca, I mean, you can almost hear the arguments against interoperability, privacy, ID theft, and all these things are so very fashionable, computer security. How do we get, and you probably couldn't hear Cory, but how do we get...
your choice of words, you could almost hear that. I'm like,
how do we free consumers from these walled gardens, weaken the moats by mandating some kind of interoperability and overcome the easy arguments that the industry will have against that kind of freedom?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that Cory was talking to me about a little bit before we started. But one of the rights that we should have is a right to exit. We've bought access to books, for example. We should have a right to be able to take those books to another platform. If we had that, there would be a much stronger case to be able to, for, authors to start, cooperative platforms, for example, where they, adapted already already developed technologies in order to be able to sell books directly, to take the retailers cut themselves. Those are potentially really exciting initiatives because in book publishing in particular, there is very little money, right? If you're looking to find new margins, you're not going to be getting it from the independent publishers who are already, like, the economics of print publishing are just absolutely balked. But you can be finding it in the retailer share, the part that's going to Amazon to move these files around. But it's going to be a very hard sell to get people to move over from these platforms that they're locked into if they can't bring their libraries with them. And so, yes, we need to have a right to exit, and we need to, that's exactly the kind of intervention that is going to encourage that countervailing power in, workers and suppliers that we were talking about as being essential for widening out these choke points.
Okay, guys. So our hour has passed quickly, but the first bit of it was spent in technical issues. So I'm going to push us a little bit, and I just want to do a kind of lightning round of contemporary issues, and we'll try to go quick. But Cory, we can't stop talking here in Silicon Valley about ChatGPT. And I just wonder, and this is right down your lane as a science fiction author, what kind of threat AI poses to the creative class, and does it suggest that creators have bigger things to worry about these days than monopolists?
No, I think that, so long as human beings like looking at pictures of other human beings with only 10 fingers, we're pretty safe. Less facetiously, I think that the problem is not that we found a way to produce reasonable looking art for free in a short period of time, nor is it that we can observe how art is made to figure out how to make other art. There is instances of like bona fide copyright infringement where one work is lifted and included in another without attribution and so on. But even if you eliminate that, you still have a pretty wide open field. The problem is the economic arrangements. Right. The problem is that is the social arrangements. It's not that the technology exists. It's that the tools we have to make them equitable aren't fit for practice. I literally just got Brian Merchant's latest book, the advanced review copy of it, Blood on the Machine, which is his book about the Luddites. And the Luddites weren't anti-loom activists. They were labor activists. They didn't want an end to textile automation. They wanted a redistribution of the fruits of textile automation. It's an historically unsupportable libel to call the Luddites anti-technology, and I think that we can be Luddites about ChatGPT too.
Okay, Rebecca, how about you? As a journalist, as an author, I'm sitting here wondering whether ChatGPT will be and its ilk will be replacing me in 5 years. What kind of danger is the creative class in?
Look, I think it's going to be disruptive in ways that we don't fully understand at all yet. And I think it is going to be a tsunami of change. I think there's exciting potential for creators, but I also don't see this replacing human inspiration for a very long time to come, if it's possible at all. I'm thinking, for example, about the designer that we had to do our beautiful stickers and pins for our book. It was her sort of vision, her idea, her asking us the right questions that we didn't know what to ask to find out really what we were trying to convey, that they translated into that message. The AI is not going to be able to do that. So all of those things that I've got to say as well, like a lot of the stuff that's produced so far feels quite soulless to me. And look, there's a lot of stock images that also feel pretty soulless to me. And so maybe, sort of real generic branding space, like that's going to be, I think, one of the places that's really disrupted. But art that makes you feel something, I don't think we're going to be seeing a lot of that from these technologies soon.
Okay, that is reassuring. Cory, a year ago, we might have been having this conversation on Twitter Spaces, and who knows, it may have even been glitch-free. But a lot of organizations have become a little allergic to Twitter under its current ownership. And I just wonder if alternatives like Mastodon, represent the kind of fairer, decentralized, pluralistic platforms you guys talk about in the book? And if so, why haven't more people embraced it?
Well, I think the reason people don't go to Mastodon is that there's a switching cost for leaving Twitter, leaving behind other services. The guy who owns Twitter now, I can never remember his name. He tried to do this thing where he was going to kick people off of the service if they put their Mastodon handles and their bios or told people where they could be found on Mastodon. He actually kicked a bunch of journalists off and then changed his mind about it. So he understands that if you can make the switching cost high enough, people will hang around even when they don't like something. I mean, we've all seen Fiddler on the Roof, right? That movie is like 3.5 hours of people who hate where they live but can't leave because they can't agree on where to go next, right? It doesn't matter that Cossacks ride through, every 15 minutes and beat the shit out of them. They're going to hang around in Anatevka. So if there was, like, if someone showed up and said, hey, every one of you can get a work visa, and we've just built a new development called Levittown, and there's a boat leaving for New York in 2 weeks, they'd all get on their ponies and head to New York and be somewhere else before you could say matchmaker. So there is on the one hand very high switching cost, and we can make it lower. I think that Mastodon does have this incredible virtue, which is not so much how it works, although it works very well. It's got a lot of really cool features, but how it fails. There's been a lot of people talking about how if you're on Mastodon, you have to pick a server, and maybe the person who runs that server is a jerk. That is apparently a thing that can also happen if you pick a server that is run by a company worth $53 billion. And the difference between the $53 billion server run by a jerk and the server that you just pick out of a list that's run by a jerk is with 2 clicks, you can leave the Mastodon server, take with you all of the people you follow and all the people who follow you. And then with 2 more clicks, you can re-import them into another service and be back up and running. And that means that, we don't have to hang around Anatevka while the Cossacks ride through and beat us up.
Right. Well, that I think is a nice, hopeful and optimistic note to end on. Cory and Rebecca, thank you guys for your time. Thank you for this tremendous book, Chokepoint Capitalism. Everybody should pick it up. And thanks again to Coil and the Internet Archive for sponsoring us here today. And great to talk to you guys. All right. We'll see you soon.
Can you tell Rebecca it was nice to see her?
And Rebecca, Cory says hello. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Brad.